Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second interview on Finding Me on the ITV networks with my very special guest, Dr. Shahid Mathee. Last week we spoke about the the rise of Islam in Timbuktu, the Timbuktu manuscripts, and of course the vibrancy of the society, the community and the people in Timbuktu. Shahid also said that from the manuscripts it was apparent that there were very many myths that could be debunked. Of course, first was that there was an African written tradition besides just an oral tradition. The second, that Muslim women were very active in the society, that they were knowledgeable, and that they participated in terms of their ordinary life. And of course, this was shown in them challenging the Mufti and of course challenging their husbands as well. With that, I'd like to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome again, and thank you for sharing this time with me, Shahid.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Shahid, you know, we have so much to speak about and I think we're going to run out of time, but we're talking about now the rise of Islam and especially this preservation of Islam in Africa, West Africa, this knowledge that has been there, the heritage. From there we realized, and you were explaining to me a little bit about empire, because from empire I need to go to Khaliphate, you know, so tracing this history from the past. But let's start in Africa. You know, what do we know about the African empires and of course the Islamic empires that were in Africa?
I think if, of course, we come to what is West Africa today, so there were three great empires. One called the Ghana Empire, not to be confused with the state Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah, in fact, took the name from the early Ghana Empire. That is established around the 3rd century of the Common Era, that is before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that continues till about the 11th century, and even sometime after that. But really, it's established then. So the kings of the Ghana Empire became Muslim. So it stretches parts of Mali and Mauritania today and other parts. But the subjects did not really become Muslim, and there was also a reason why they, in fact, some of the kings preferred their people not to become Muslim. So that's the Ghana Empire. So Al-Bakri, the early Muslim historians and geographers like Al-Bakri and Al-Idrisi writes about them. Then we have what is called the Mali Empire. Again, not to be confused with the country Mali today. This is established around at the end of the 1200s, where the great, you know, they speak about the Epic of Sunjata. But the one person who stands out is the king called Mansa Musa or Kankan Musa, who is the person who does Hajj, of course, at the beginning of the 1300s. And he comes back, he builds the masjid in Timbuktu, as we learn in history, and then, you know, he goes back to the Mali Empire, Kankan Musa, and he also took a lot of gold with him to Egypt. Then the Mali Empire is not really succeeded, but in the mid-15th century, by 1460, we have the rise of what is called the Songhai Empire, which is much further to the east. And this is really where the heartland, where Timbuktu and the political capital called Gao is situated. The one founder, even though there are founders before him, but the one great founder is a man called Soni Ali, who rules from about 1468 to about 1492. On his death, he is succeeded by his general, who overthrows his son, and he's called Al-Hajj Askia Muhammad. Askia is a title of people of royal family, and he becomes a second, and he's really considered the great founder or the great person of the Song Empire. He also does Hajj. And very interestingly, if we're going to speak about Khilafat, there's a chronicle, 17th century Timbuktu chronicle, that has been tempered to it. Apparently he meets the Sharif of Makkah, Abbas, and this is all, you won't find that. And he also meets with Al-Imam As-Suyuti, the great author of Tafsir al-Jalalain. And apparently, and this also is not his historical, you know, cannot be corroborated, but they tell him that he will be the 11th Amir. The Prophet speaks, as a hadith in Bukhari, the Prophet speaks about 12 Amirs. All of them will be from Quraysh. Now, according to this chronicle that has been tempered with, the Sharif of Makkah told him that you are the 11th one, and the 12th one will come in the 1800s, and thereafter the Mahdi will come. So it's interesting again to see how religion and how deen is taken, how hadith is taken for establishing political power. So these are the three steps. states. I think it's best probably to call them states, or empires.
Okay, but considering that we have this divide between now West Africa and the rest of Africa, you interestingly made a very important comment, and you said that this divide between sub-Saharan Africa and the north doesn't really exist.
No, absolutely. It's a colonial. The colonialists found it, of course, because the colonialists had to speak about the Arab invasions, about the Arabs themselves being a colonial force in order to justify their colonial, colonizing of Africa. So then they wanted to say that these Arabs, they are an invading force, so we are also doing just what they did, and therefore we need to divide Africa into two, what is called North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's a myth, because geographically and culturally, people share many things in common. The Sahara, geographically speaking, does not divide Africa. It seals Africa, as Ghislaine Leiden says. And when it comes to culture, the people in Timbuktu, them and the Algerians and Libyans and all, they've been trading for hundreds of years, long before colonialism. So in fact, even terms such as black and white, these terms really rise. Concept of race come in the 20th century. People would not refer to themselves always as black, and so like the Fulanis, who would be considered today black, would never have called themselves black, and white. Even though, of course, there is in the literature where people speak about Al-Bidan. Even the word Sankore, what is called the University of Timbuktu, the great is called Sankore, or like white master. So yes, there were some notion of division, but in a broader sense, there is no such divide as Sub-Saharan Africa versus North Africa. It's a colonial invention.
Okay, so considering this obsession with empire, of course, and from there we move to the new notion today of Khaliphate, and we see that the rise of the Islamic State, or the Islamic Khaliphate as it has been called. How do we trace this origin, and why is Khaliphate so important to Muslims? I know it starts from the tradition after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with the 4 Khalifas, and after that we have the Umayyad and the Abbasid empires, but people often refer to them as Khalifates also.
Yes, well, Khilaf, of course, as we know, means man yakhluf ar-Rasul, who is to succeed the Prophet. Now that the Muslim Ummah has been established, I like the view that says that it's hirasatud deen in a particular way, not uncritical of it, but saying who now protects the deen. Even before we speak about political power, we know that in Quran, Allah said to the angels that I will make a Khalifa on earth, who will implement what Allah wants for insan, for his creation, etc. So Khilafah, as you say, has always been there. So to decay the political succession of the Prophet, the religious succession of the Prophet, of course not as a Prophet, as is the final Prophet and the final Rasul, but yet there's an Ummah now, and who takes care of the Ummah and who sees that the laws of deen are implemented. And this has been over the centuries. So the question, and of course to take it further, to what extent do those Muslims who make claims over the centuries, not only on ISIS now, to what extent are they in line with the Muslim legacy? And also to what extent does the Muslim legacy allow people to make these claims? So yes, all the time you have people claiming to be Amirul Mu'mineen. In fact, the King of Morocco calls himself, is called Amirul Mu'mineen, the same title that that has since.
But he doesn't lay claim to the Khaliphate per se, isn't it?
He doesn't call it Khilafat, but certainly he sees himself, as
the Amirul Mu'mineen
of the people of Morocco. I don't know now that the colonial state had established borders, and so how does the Moroccan king look at it now? And therefore, for example, the Saadian state invaded Timbuktu because he says, I'm Amirul Mu'mineen, so I have the right to invade Timbuktu. And that is why they destroyed the Songhai state in 1591. And this happened, of course, with the Ottomans when they defeated the Mamluks, etc. And throughout history.
And all of these leaders have claimed for themselves a caliphate.
Yes, if you look history, of course, the early Ayyubis and the Buwayyids would not have claimed Khilafah simply because they said that the Hadith said that the Khalifa must come from Quraysh. As is stated in a hadith. Okay,
but if that is the case, then how do we trace this heritage amongst the Abbasid and the Umayyads then?
Well, because they are from Quraysh. Okay. They trace their lineage. And this thing of genealogy is very important among the Arabs.
Tribes,
some people say you can find Arabs today that if you do come from a certain Arab tribe, they can trace their lineage, your lineage back.
Right.
Right up till the Prophet and even before that.
Right.
Genealogy, this ansab is a very important thing among Arabs. So certainly the Umayyads and the Abbasids. Therefore, the actual de facto rulers of the Muslims, say from Salahuddin al-Ayyub and even before him, Salahuddin al-Ayyub was the de facto ruler of the Muslim after he defeated the Crusades. However, he always read the khutbah in the name of the Abbasid Khalif because he said, because Salahuddin was a Kurd.
Yeah, he was not a Quraysh.
He was not Quraysh, he was not Arab, etc. You see, so yes, this is all.
So there is this particular reverence to that understanding amongst the old leaders, for example, de facto rulers like Salahuddin.
Salahuddin,
yes. And did it happen amongst other de facto rulers, for example, like the Ottomans?
Not with the Ottomans, because now we see things changing. Because for the Ottomans, maybe for a while, but when the Ottomans really become this great empire, I think by then, the whole notion of Quraysh had all but disappeared. The interesting thing with ISIS is that ISIS are the first people who revive that. Like Osama bin Laden had paid allegiance to Muli Omar Akhund, and he's Afghan, he's Pathan, he's not Arab, he's not Quraysh. I'm not comfortable myself with all these, but for the sake of a discussion. So ISIS revives this Quraysh factor, if you want.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the reviving of the Quraysh factor when we come back from the break. See you then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the final segment of Finding Me in the ITV networks in this part 2, segment 2 of my interview with Dr. Shahid Mathee. And before we went on to the break, Shahid, you were explaining about the Khaliphate and the Quraysh lineage, and you said, interestingly enough, the Islamic State is the first one to revive this particular heritage. Now, how does one then understand this in terms of the geopolitical context where Al-Qaeda has always maintained the leadership, and they have an Amir al-Mu'minin who is not Quraysh. Now you have somebody who is Quraysh. Has it been verified that he is from Quraysh lineage? How does all of this fit into place?
Well, I don't know if it's been verified. There's this whole, there are so many people who are called Sayyid, or Ashraf,
Yes.
So, there's a hadith that says, a person is to be believed in
if he
claim.
says yes.
Of course, there are ways to establish whether a person is or is not. But I think more importantly or greater than that is to say how ISIS, because originally, there's a long story, and I think a person like Omar Shaukat was able to explain.
Yes.
But at least we can speak of the link between before it became ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq, and before that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and before the split came between the two, at least in the last 1 or 2 years. So I think the Qurayshi thing would have given ISIS now, or its leader, Abu Bakr, Ibrahim Awad, who is known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, it makes his claim higher than that of Ayman al-Zawahiri and Muli Umar Akhund, by saying that, the hadith states it must be from Quraysh. So it's really how this is used. And I think then, of course, and ISIS have really used it in a particular way to say that, our leader, our candidate, if you want, he is from Quraysh. And in the early books of political theory, such as Al-Mawardi and earlier scholars, they, of course, all stated that Quraysh is a factor, that lineage, the person who becomes Khalifa, not Sultan, because, they separate between Sultan, Khalifa must be from Quraysh. So this is how ISIS has used it. Of course, a bit later scholars, such as the Muslim philosopher of history, Ibn Khaldun, has a different explanation. He says, no, Quraysh doesn't mean the person literally has to be from Quraysh. It is rather linked to the notion of Asabiyya, group loyalty, that Quraysh was the strongest tribe in the Arabian Peninsula.
So who can command authority and power?
Once that factor no longer exists as another strong tribe, then Quraysh no longer matters. You see, this is how Ibn Khaldun, of course.
So it is a matter of interpretation, isn't it?
Certainly. One would want to say that everything is interpreted, but it's interpreted for a particular political discourse.
Yes.
I can take power. And so for example,
I claim legitimacy through this hadith.
Certainly. The king of Morocco comes from the Prophet's family. So now you may have a hadith that may cause a problem, and I would want to know how ISIS would deal with it, where it says when one person has been declared Khalifa, then a next person can't claim it.
So now we've got two. Okay.
And how do you deal with the second one? However, Muslim political theorists did deal with if there are two.
Oh, okay.
So,
what did they say?
Mawardi,
Yeah.
as far as I can recall, they say that, well, it may be necessary. We can deal with two at the time,
Okay.
you know. There were, of course, others who absolutely rejected it, especially the one who says that if the one claims after the second one, kill the second one, you know, because it will create division, etc. I think it's just interesting to see, you know, how people may use the legacy, how we choose and how we select from it what we want. For whatever reason, and what is to be the response.
You know, you started right at the beginning where you said about Hafsuddin, about the protection of the deen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering now, okay, Islamic State has come about to say that we're here now to protect the deen. But at the same time, all the Muslim majority countries have rejected the Islamic State. Nobody is recognizing the Khaliphate. Yet all of these people claim some kind of a title or a position for themselves. For example, we have Haramain, Sharifain, etc. Where did their legitimacy comes from? Because in terms of Islamic leadership, you know, I thought a lot about this. Ati'ullah wa ati'ur Rasul wa ulul amri minkum. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it in the Quran. So you obey Allah, you obey His Messenger and the leaders amongst you. But when Allah speaks about leaders in the Quran, I am almost certain He's speaking of people of value and character. Somebody is only a leader if you resemble in Allah's language that He's used here in the Quran, and He's put it with Ati'ullah wa Ati'ur Rasul, obviously somebody who has the character of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is here to establish leadership. If it's just an ordinary leader, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wouldn't have used that word, because you have people in power who are zalim. Sure. Right? So if the words in the Quran are so specifically used, and in my opinion, therefore, if it's this ulul amri minkum is placed next to Ati'ullah wa Ati'ur Rasul, it means somebody who is of exceptional character. So this claim that we are your leaders, in my opinion, many of them, most of those in the majority countries, I mean, these are zalim, these are oppressors. You cannot put them in the same category and say now because the Quran says that you have to obey them unequivocally without challenging them. It doesn't make sense to me, and I'm interpreting it from a layman's perspective. It's just logic. You know, how can you follow somebody who is oppressive? So this whole question about leadership and these Muslim majority countries rejecting the Islamic State rejecting the Muslim majority countries, the quarrel over Khaliphate, etc. Where does this take us? I mean, how do ordinary Muslims respond to the situation?
Unfortunately, just yesterday, Hosni Mubarak has been declared,
released.
Unbelievable. Yeah. And throughout, true. I mean, you can go back, for example, the leadership of what is called the Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain from their father, you know, their relationship with the British, with British colonialism.
And to interrupt you there, do they have Qurayshi lineage?
No, I don't think so. I'm not aware that they claim Qurayshi lineage. They come from the Najd, from the central province. I don't think they have. But certainly, for example, the king of Jordan, you know, they came from Makkah, of course, when they had the agreement with Lawrence of Arabia and they were betrayed by the Sykes-Picot agreement. Yes. Certainly the king of Morocco, so they call Al-Mamlaka al-Hashimiyya, the Hashemite kingdom. Yes. So not only are they from Quraysh, but even from the Prophet's family within Quraysh. Okay. I know the king of Morocco, Saddam Hussein, at one stage also claimed that he's from the Prophet's family. So this is a political weapon, I mean, with all of them. And even if they are from the Prophet's lineage, as you said, the Quran had outlined there are certain characteristics that la yanalu ahadi dhalimin, that my covenant are not with those who are wrongdoers. Yes. But beyond that, then the question of shura arises. Even so, part of the characteristics, as you stated, would be shura. I mean, here a question should be asked for ISIS, you know, how was it declared? Was it what the Muslim political theorists called Ahlul Hil wal Aqd? You know, the people who lose and bind. In other words, who state the reasons as to why a person can become the Khalifa or not. So there are those questions. So certainly there needs to be a critical discourse with all of them. So the current Muslim rulers, including ISIS, you know, and if it is simply about taking power by force, or even if you have the correct characteristics, part of the correct characteristics would be that they're shura. Yes. And that critical question must be asked of ISIS. I don't think that has happened in the case of ISIS, but I certainly agree with you. I mean, the current guys who are ruling the Muslim world, I mean,
it's sad. Mubarak was released. Sisi is in power, but he's been endorsed by Saudi Arabia, by Jordan, by Kuwait, all of these countries, which puts a lot of question marks on top of the leadership. And that's why perhaps you see a flocking of Muslims to the Islamic State, because it's countering this, what we see in terms of the hegemonic control of Islam by these so-called illegitimate leaders. Not so-called, they are illegitimate leaders, but by these so-called leaders who claim to have the monopoly on Islam. But now coming back to a very important question. Shahid, the context is so fluid, it is so conflictual, it is so dynamic, and there are so many forces operating at the same time. And the minute you mention anything about Islam, the negative forces are compounded against you. How does Islamic State then, really go about consulting with 1.2 billion Muslims to say we want to make shura and we want to be... it's not practically possible in terms of borders, in terms of boundaries, in terms of just the fact that you mentioned Islam. So where are we ever going to get that situation where everybody can sit and be in shura?
Look, firstly, I think for me, Quraysha, if I'm to be critical of ISIS or the Islamic State, my question is the Ummah survives without a state. The state is important. I think it will be good to have a state. My question rather is that, does Islam cease to exist if we don't have a state? And I think the early Muslim scholars realized that when they look, if you look at people like Al-Imam al-Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, they were faced with illegitimate rulers. They were faced with oppressors. But they said, look, and often many of them, or most of them in fact, did not advocate rising up. Some did. We can talk about another time as to whether we should advocate rising up against... I think certainly there should be a critique and we shouldn't just accept it. However, for them, Islam would have survived because the deen of Allah, and their focus was the ummah rather than the structures of power. So yes, I think yet still, so the question for all claimants to the Khilafat is to then critically look at themselves and say that yet the Ummah will survive with a state or without a state. But if we are going to go for the state, I do think it's important that we keep the imperative, the ethical deen imperative. It says that yes, Allah then speaks about shura, because now when one takes power because of the difficult conditions and say we'll consult later, I'm not sure whether we get the Muslim Ummah out of the predicament that we are. So, if anything has happened, I think it's more, look at the fighting in Ain al-Arab, which is also known as Kobani. Who dies?
Muslims are killing Muslims. Yeah.
Of course. I also know, and the imperialists are. When the Americans are fighting and throwing their bombs, it is the ordinary men and women. I think that at this stage we should be patient and say that yes, Allah will make things good for us. Of course, we strive, we study, we exert ourselves, but the state in itself does not mean that Islam won't survive. I know it's a difficult statement for many, as you say, people are flocking and sometimes become impatient, but I think we still got to keep that in mind at least. Okay,
so I think that's a very positive note on which you're going to end. And as you were speaking where you said, and all the scholars said that Islam will survive, I think of the verse and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard.
Absolutely.
Mathalu nurihi kamishkat. And then, so of course we know that Allah is nuru samawati wal ard, and that nur will continue, the flame will continue to burn, and the Muslims are passionate. We just hope that we can go from Muslim to mu'min, because when we go there, then it's nasrun min Allahi wa fathun kareeb wa bashiril mu'minin, So we need to get to that point. As a parting comment.
And just as an example to say, firstly, shukran again for having us in this interview, Quraysha, and to ITV. But if you look at the Muslims of India, when the Mughal state ended in 1857, here we see Deoband coming to play its great role. There was no Islamic State anymore. But Deoband and other centers of learning, and other ulama, not only Deoband,
kept the flame burning.
I have a critique, for example, of the Tabligh Jama, but I think they played a great role.
They kept the flame burning.
Yeah. Absolutely. I really think that. And I think all Muslims do that.
So we need to keep the flame burning. Jazakallah khair. Fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.